everyone. How are we doing today? Hopefully great. Phil, how are you?
I'm doing all right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm excited about this conversation. I'm excited for what you're going to show us. I think that, we all kind of see the symptoms of the problem you're trying to solve around policing, equity, and justice, right? When if you go on your Twitter feed every other day, right? There's something happening that we all, or at least I think most of us probably look at and with some mixture of concern, surprise, bafflement, but ultimately all of these things that are happening are really just a symptom of a larger issue which has significant root causes and policy implications in terms of how we think about policing and justice. And so I'm excited to hear from you about, how did you get involved in this? What was your eureka moment in terms of thinking through how do we identify these root causes and ultimately come up with some solutions to these challenges?
So I'm a professional nerd, right? So I'm a professor, and that's kind of what I do. I'm also a nerd in my spare time. And it turns out that if you're both a professional nerd and a nerd in your spare time, what you spend a lot of time thinking about is exactly that kind of thing. Root causes. What's the origin story of this supervillain and the rest? I thought when I walked into my first police department that I would figure out that there were bad people doing bad things. So context for me, I grew up in West Philadelphia, actually was literally born and raised there, and I spent some time in Bel Air. My godkids call me Uncle Phil, so go ahead and do the song in your head. But I graduated from high school with Mumia Abu-Jamal's son. And for those of you who don't know, Mumia Abu-Jamal was convicted of killing an officer and then was later found out to be framed by the Philadelphia Police Department. So I had a really particular idea of what I was going to find when I walked into my first police department. And as it turned out, I found not any of that. I found a bunch of incredibly dedicated folks, and I found a bunch of really dysfunctional systems because it's a city governance. It's one of the largest, if not the largest expenditure in every municipality. And I found folks trying to do the right thing and not knowing, ironically, the right things to measure. Right? And the most important part of it was everybody had a theory about what the problem was. This is before Trayvon Martin, before Ferguson. I was doing this policing stuff way before it was sexy. It was about the sexiness of kind of me, so like none at all. And it turns out the theories mattered. The chief's theory of the problem was, I got chuckleheads here, if you could help me get them out, it'd be better. Right? The line officer's theory of the problem was, there are 5 terrible people in these neighborhoods, and that makes all of our stats look terrible. And the community theory of the problem was, we've got racist officers, and once those racist officers are exposed, you'll find out that policing deeply is racist. And the shocking moment for me was about a decade ago, going in and looking at their numbers and saying, my guess is none of you are able to tell me the percentage of racial disparities that we see in stops and use of force, any of that, the percentage of racial disparities that belongs to police departments. The part of the problem that police behavior is driving, as opposed to crime, as opposed to poverty, as opposed to all of these sort of other, the basics of what leads to crime. And if we could measure it, could you hold yourselves accountable to it? And when I asked the question, everybody stopped and everybody's like, well, that would be, how do you measure racism? And so for the last decade, what we've been doing is figuring out how to measure it in cities and police departments.
So tell us about the kinds of data that you're trying to collect or have successfully collected and what that looks like and how you're then using that to inform the kinds of hypotheses and questions you're asking.
So Center for Policing Equity is the largest research and action think tank on race and policing in the world. It's a super humble brag. There's not a lot of folks out there doing it. We also are a host of the National Justice Database, which is the first and largest database of police behavior in the world. Also super humble brag. It's just that we're bigger than the FBI and the White House. There's just not a lot out there on it. But what that allows us to do is we collect data from all the departments that are willing on police use of force, not just shootings, but all force, police vehicle stops, pedestrian stops, crime, and complaints against officers. Okay? Of the 18,000 police departments in the country, it's important to note 75% of those 18,000 are 25 officers or fewer. What that means is they don't have any data, right? They don't have ink fingerprints. They've got the memory of the thing that happened last month. That's the kind of data they've got. In California, a third of police departments don't collect any data at all on police behavior. But from the ones that do, right, those are largely in the big cities, and they've frequently and mostly given us the data so that we can connect what they're doing in the street to the crime rate, to the poverty rate, to the high school dropout rate, right, the single-headed families rate, and then also access to their officers, so we can survey them. I told you I was a nerd. My brand of nerddom is I'm a psychologist. So we survey them on bias, and we survey them on commitment to the job. And when we put all that together in basically a regression gumbo, right, what we can get is this is the percentage of the variance that crime is responsible for in terms of the number of use of force incidents and the racial disparity. This is the percentage of the variance that high school dropout is responsible for. This is the percentage of the variance that your officers saying, I don't like black folks and I don't like Muslims is responsible for, which is usually not the largest, but also not zero. And this is the percentage that your policies are likely responsible for. And when we put that together, we say here, in this turducken of awfulness, here is the part that belongs to you. Let me slide that across the table. And as it turns out, when we do that kind of analysis, what usually jumps to the front is, and by the way, it's mostly your foot pursuits that are driving this. Maybe take a look at your foot pursuit policy. Las Vegas, when we said that, they said, our what? I said, okay, you should have a foot pursuit policy, because that's what's the leading indicator of your burdensome and disparate use of force. So when you start optimizing to the right metric, instead of it being feelings and hearts and minds, it's actually disparities and the percentage that you seem to be responsible for. You can create systems that police are used to dealing with, like CompStat.
Tell us more about some of the surprises you found in doing this. I mean, I love the practical example of Las Vegas foot pursuit policy. This is leading to a disproportionate issue.
Yeah. So that was kind of surprising to me, and it's a lovely story to tell. But we did not rehearse this ahead of time, but that's the greatest cue up you can have. So in Las Vegas, they were really, this is back prior to in the past administration, they were worried they were going to get sued for using force too much, which was reasonable because they were using force too much, and they were told they were going to get sued. You kind of get how I tell stories here. So they called us up, as they do, and they said, hey, we really want some help before we get sued, before we're put under a consent decree. Can you help us? 7 or 8 phone calls later, I'm in a rental car meeting Las Vegas Metro Police Department officers in a rental car in the desert, all black. They opened their trunks. I'm wearing a red carnation. It was awesome. And they gave us their use of force files. And so we went through them by hand. Foot pursuit, foot pursuit, foot pursuit, foot pursuit. They knocked one guy off a bike. It became a foot pursuit. I said, what the heck is going on with these? Now, one thing it's important for folks who don't deal with policing a lot to know is foot pursuits don't end the way that you probably think they do. They don't end with the one old black cop tackling a guy and getting him saying, I'm getting too old for this shit. They end when the very young and athletic person who's being chased by the tubby person in the vest is like, I'm way faster than you, but I'm not faster than radio. Please don't hurt me. Right? They get surrounded and then they give up. But what happens for the officer is, and I've been in these foot pursuits, lagging very far behind, huffing and puffing, you're sweating and your adrenaline is really high, and you know for a moral fact that person's a bad guy because they ran. And around every corner could be somebody that they set up to hurt me, to help them. So my politics are to the left of Trotsky, right? But when I showed up at the end of my first foot pursuit, I wanted to give a guy a shot to the kidneys for the price of making me run. So after we looked and we saw, hey, your burdensome use of force is after foot pursuits, and also your racially disparate force is after foot pursuits, that feels like a trap that any human is going to fall into. Give me one policy. This is the thing that I usually say to a department. Give me a certain number of policies. Give me one policy. Say, what's the policy? The first guy to respond after a foot pursuit can't be the first one to touch him. That's it. First guy there can't be the first one to touch him. Right? So the union was not happy. The sheriff was like, I'm not running again. Let's do it. And then when they did it, surprising to everybody but the social scientists, use of force goes down across the board by 24%. Not just after foot pursuits, but all use of force goes down 24%. And officer-related injuries go down by 11%. Right? So when you take the chance to start measuring the things that actually matter, it turns out law enforcement can do something about that. That's one of my favorite surprises in all of this. Also because it means I get to go back to Vegas regularly and I get a police escort to the casinos, which if you get a chance, go right ahead. That's awesome.
So you have a demo that I'm dying to see, but before we do, one of the interesting things I think that's come out of this is the idea of measuring community trust. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about that. What does that actually look like? That feels like a very sort of wishy-washy concept that you could never apply numbers to. Tell us about how you've done that and what that looks like.
Yeah, there's two things working really hard against doing policing the right way, some of the most fundamental things we understand. One is that when we say that compliance with the law begins with trust in it and not fear of it, right? Like that feels true, it is true, it's scientific consensus, but trust feels kind of like you want to hug somebody afterwards, right? And that's not consistent with the culture of law enforcement, right? And the other thing is the way that folks have been doing it forever. Right? The idea is that if there's a stiff penalty, you're deterring people from doing something. Okay, just quick show of hands. Who in here has ever raised a toddler? Okay, and who has not choked that child out and allowed them to get to the age of teenager? I see fewer hands. Okay, so you guys know what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter how much you say what the consequences are. The human mind goes through whatever, I can get away with that, right? And the most powerful thing you can do in raising someone who is doing something wrong is be the example of what you're hoping they will be. The power of your example is the most powerful thing you have in raising a child. And I shouldn't say that any of these communities should be likened to children, but it works the same way with folks who are going through a rough time, right? So measuring trust is literally just asking, how much do you trust that the police are going to treat you fairly? How much do you trust that you're going to have a voice in these moments when you interact with the police? And it turns out that is more predictive of calling the police, of cooperating, of informing when someone has committed a murder, right? Than fear that you're going to be victimized by criminals, than the likelihood of your victimization, the number of people that you know that are going to be victimized. It's trust. And think about it just like this. If someone has hurt me, and I believe the person I'm going to call to fix a solution is going to hurt me the same or worse, why would I ever think about picking up the phone? And you can literally ask it with 2 or 3 questions and have a better chance of predicting the areas where crime is going to happen than any other information about crime. Trust is that biggest predictor. And
I imagine it's important to measure and steward, right? Because it's the kind of thing that takes a lifetime to build and a few seconds to break.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So yeah, the critical incident of this person got beat up for no reason, that's 2 decades worth of police work is our estimate.
Wow. So you've got all these mechanisms, you've got all these approaches, practically, how does a city, how do the folks in this room take advantage of that? What are the tools that you can offer them? And maybe perhaps you could show us some of them right now that they should be thinking about in terms of how they do this. So it turns out that police data, and I don't want to get too technical, they are shitty. They're incredibly crappy just from a data management perspective. It's because they're not set up to do anything like analysis, right? Crime data are slightly better, but behavioral data are just the worst. We were looking through just trying to geolocate incidents in one of our cities. We looked at the street address for one of the incidents, and the street address was literally cheese. They wrote down the word cheese for the street address. I assumed they were making an order and they just got confused about where they wrote it down. I'm saying the data are bad. You understand what I'm saying? So to get an analysis for a single city, and we've got, again, about 1/3 of the United States by population in the National Justice Database. So that's hundreds and hundreds of cities. But to get one for a single city done takes a team of 3 PhD-level researchers. I lock them in a cage. I cut off their eyelids. I say, you get out when you're done. At their best, about 9 to 12 months. Right? And I heard someone ask if you could do it faster if they didn't have PhDs. Turns out, no, that's as fast as we can go. And anybody who works in city governments knows that's not a reasonable time frame, right? So we're justice nerds. That was as fast as we can go. Right after the last election, a bunch of justice geeks from Google came together and they said, hey, we think we can help you do that faster. So we're now on some of these elements down from 9 to 12 months to 9 to 12 seconds. Wow. And that turns out is faster and better.
It takes us about 9 to 12 days to actually, and literally a little bit longer because of the volume we've got coming in. But if we're focused on one, about 9 to 12 days to get it done. And let me show you just a little bit about what that makes possible. So just show of hands, who knows what CompStat is in policing? All right, so many folks, and it's concentrated on this side of the room, interesting segregation on CompStat. I won't count, you guys work that out later during lunch. But CompStat is essentially the system by which law enforcement holds itself accountable to crime stats. They map it, they give the time frame for it, and they literally say, all right, wherever there's crime, let's put cops on dots on the map. And by doing that, they use their creativity and they use their presence to reduce the crime. Well, so we said, what happens if we could do a crime stat for justice or a crime stat for, or a CompStat for racism? And Google said, yeah, we can build that for you. So if I can get the monitor on, let me show you what this looks like. Again, 9 to 12 months just to clean the data. Can any, I can't see over here. Can you see that this is now too small to see? Let's see if I can make it slightly larger and larger and larger. The miracle of technology. So I'm gonna not stand up because I'm gonna be standing and sitting if I do. But what you can see now is literally just before we got on, I press Command R to have it clean the data, and it does it just this fast. Okay? So this is all the missing data, all the indecipherable data, and it does this by cell. So in the about 300,000 rows of data, everyone is audited, and it also does a data set audit to say, you know what? There are people who live in this area, so the demographics of folks who live in this area that are not showing up. We think they're cooking the books. So you have cheater detection right away built in to the auditing of the product, right? I say the product, but I'm terrible at selling anything. This is just software we use and we give away for free. So I'm going to use the example of Austin Police Department because their data are public, but we've done some Gaussian noise distribution, so this is not exactly what Austin looks like. But here's the cool thing about working with Google. They've done this thing called Google Maps, right? And so this is a map of literally every single incident of use of force over the past 5 years in Austin. Okay, this is the real data. And if I were to hover over this, I can click on it, and not only does it give me every piece of the incident, it also pulls from the census and the American Community Survey, and now I have the demographic information in the census tract where this happened. I've also got the crime information that we've got from the department, and in departments where we've done survey, I've got the census level or the division level information on how officers think about the community, their level of bias, their level of concern for their own manhood, which turns out for men is a problem, surprising every woman in the room, I know. But here's the thing that you thought you wanted. This is a map of Austin, and it's a heat map for racial disparities in the use of force. And you can see, let's take a look at Division 6 here, right? I'm looking at the black population, I'm looking at the incidents with black subjects in terms of use of force, and the total incidents, so the percentage of the total incidents across the city, right? I can do this for day, night, and swing, I can do it for black folks, Latinx, non-white, Asian, American Indian, and I can do this for pedestrian stops and vehicle stops as well. I can do it for overall burden, and I can also do it for the racial disparities, right? This is the thing that most people want to be able to see in every police department, right? They want to see the racial disparities. And this is a red flag, because racial disparities, right, that means that there's something out of whack. But again, disparities are not the end goal. Because if I tell you that black folks are twice as likely in Division 6, right, to have force used against them, any skeptical chief or responsible scientist is going to say, well, how much of that is driven by crime? And that is where the conversation has stopped in policing since forever. But you'll notice I have another tab to push. These are the predictors, okay?
Wow.
So this is the degree, what I'm showing you here is just the biggest predictor, the largest predictor in each of the 10 divisions in Austin. You can see crime, poverty, racial bias. That's the officer saying, I don't like black people. We're not subtle when we measure this stuff. And then residual, which is usually the policy, right? The set of policies. And you'll see that crime and poverty are the two biggest predictors in the largest number of districts, but sometimes it's crime, right? Sometimes it's poverty, and sometimes it's bias. And in every place, every division, racial bias is not zero as a predictor, right? And I can, if I want to, just look at the heat map for racial bias in each of these. And you'll see the place where the largest disparity is Division 6 is not the place where racial bias is the biggest predictor. okay? This allows for law enforcement to hold themselves accountable for the things they say are their values in the same way that they hold themselves accountable for crime. And with the software, this is a prototype, right? But once it's fully developed by hopefully the end of the year, they can do it in real time. Which means they can say, once they make this public as they do their CompStat data, this is how we're working to reduce our footprint on society's problem on race. Right? The last couple of weeks, all we seem to have been seeing is whatever's happening in DC that day, that hour, that minute, and folks calling the cops on black folks for doing nothing, right? So I want to be really clear, in working with law enforcement is a tool of the public, right? But this is the stuff that they can do to make themselves better. And I should say, to sort of wrap on the demo portion of this, they're the ones who asked for it. Law enforcement comes to us. We don't work in any departments where NAACP or ACLU sends us. The chief has to reach out to us. We're like vampires that way. We have to be invited in to do our mischief. Law enforcement asked for this in 2012, months before Trayvon Martin was shot and killed. They said, we need a national database that tells us where we're at, because otherwise we're just going to keep doing the same thing and same thing and same thing. And the important part of this for me is that, again, I started with definitions. The definition here of the problem is not the hearts and minds of the officers. The definition is we start with the disparities and we work our way backwards for the part that law enforcement can do something about. And you put nerds and geeks together, we built the pyramids, right? Good big things can happen. And this is what we're trying to do. Every police department that's got the data to do it. We've just announced in Connecticut, we've got the whole state doing it. And so hopefully we're going to be coming to a city near you.
This is really exciting. I have one question. I also want to open it up to the audience. We're probably going to have time for maybe 2-3 questions, so think about them and get mics to folks. While they're doing that, I'm fascinated by this. Here's my question for you. Is this an answers machine or a questions machine? Is this about giving you, here's some answers, or is it about figuring out the right questions to ask with the real work then beginning?
So you know that I'm a social scientist, right? So you know what my answer is, yes. Of course, it's both, right? So this allowed us, when we were able to sort of redo it, and it's fine to keep it off, just the memory of it, let it burn and sear in your head. But we could use this to identify that it was foot pursuits in Las Vegas, but do the same thing. You're gonna find it's handcuffing in Oakland. It's what's called curb sitting, where they take you out of your car and you have to sit in your hands in San Jose. It's bike confiscation in Tampa, and it's stop and frisk here in New York, right? So it's identifying the place that has the largest burden and the largest disparity anywhere. But just like CompStat doesn't give you the answer for how you reduce homicide or car thefts, sometimes you got to show up and find out the reason why there's more car thefts is, oh, they shut down the parking garage, and now people who are used to not locking their cars because it's in a secure facility are not locking their cars on the street. A little creative problem solving is absolutely necessary if we're going to manage this. I don't think that's beyond us, though. And this is the important part. When you start measuring the things that matter, you can hold yourself accountable to them. And when it's a hard problem, we come back in. But at the very least, let's give these tools to the folks who want to use them so that we've got technology that makes us more able to be consistent with our values.
Fantastic. All right, who's got a question? Who's got the mic? Someone? Oh, over there.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mogilescu from Bennett Midland. I want to say thank you. That was a great presentation. It's really exciting to see all the things we're going to learn. Given where we are at the Engaged Cities Summit, one of the things that I've always wondered and have been struggling with is how infrequently it is that when we deal with policing issues, there is the merger of citizen engagement and policing. So when you think about this, I mean, there's community-oriented policing, blah, 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 but when you think about the power of this machine or what it is that we're learning, are there real opportunities to bring in communities to help understand what it means and how to respond?
So thank you for the question. In the last several years, there's been a big push for open data, open policing data. I'm telling you that's going to solve none of your problems, okay? I'm not against it. I'm a scientist. More data, yes please, all the time, every day. But the issue is the analyses. The issue is not just the data. The data are mute on their own. It's what do they say? And what we've seen over the past several years is, for lack of a better word, because I know this isn't being live streamed, so I can say, racial agony tourists coming into the space of policing and saying, I know the answer. The folks who've been doing this for a long time know that all that mess is exactly that. It's mess. But what you can do is, instead of making the data public, or in addition, make this public. Because when we've done this in the cities where we work, we're part of the national initiative with DOJ, National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, because DOJ is great at naming things. When we make this public, the public stops queuing on fire this officer, fire this chief. They start queuing on, yeah, we knew it was happening there. Here's our perspective on what you need to bring this down. So this creates the table at which everybody can sit and trusting the process when they can't trust each other. And I say trust the process not just because I'm from Philadelphia. So that's the hope in it. Do we have time for one more question?
Let's do one more, and then I'm assuming you'll stick around through lunch so that people can bug you all.
You won't get a chance 5 minutes after I'm here. Yes, absolutely.
One more. Who's got the mic? Oh, there we go.
Hi, my name is Ijama, and I'm from JP Morgan Chase. And I'm just curious, who in law enforcement is responsible for moving the needle on these numbers once they actually get them?
So it's almost always going to be the chief first, and then it'll be, depending on the size of the department, chief of patrol, and on down. But the reality is none of this moves without the sergeants. The first line supervisors are the folks who are going to be able to make it move. In paramilitary organizations like American law enforcement, it frequently is the case that when the chief says move and the chief has some numbers that they're going to be looking at, you actually do get results. But if the sergeants aren't brought in, then you don't get anything moving. One of the reasons why we act like vampires, why we have to be invited in, is because every time you FOIA a police department, you should know you're not getting all of the data. Right? If they don't want to help you, there's no way that you're going to get their help. So we have to work with the departments that are willing and eager to do that. The good news is, with hundreds of departments in, it's the majority of urban spaces. And as it becomes more popular, you start leveraging sort of, do you want to be the last ones in on it? All right? But hope that answers your question.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time.
Says so.
Thank you so much for demoing this tool. I think anybody who is committed to this issue, who is seeing this opportunity to actually measure fundamental issues around justice and policing in a new way, should be reaching out and trying to figure out how to make sure they're doing this in the city and actually using this data and asking the questions that need to be asked. And I personally am really excited about actually seeing all these tools come together and actually being able to look and understand how my community and my city is being impacted. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for participating and listening. And I'm sure this is just the beginning of a much longer conversation.
Thank you.